So this is a successor paper to the talk that I gave at Balliol that some of you heard. So there was kind of an interesting situation at Balliol. I gave a talk where I said that Prior was one of the very first people to practice possible world semantics for modal logic, and Max Cresswell gave a talk where he said Prior hated semantics, never did semantics. So there's sort of a tension to be resolved there. And I think the answer is that, well, we're both right, actually. Max and I are both right. And this paper is sort of, it's kind of a, not really a reply to Max's, but sort of a commentary on Max's paper that tries to make out the claim that we're both right. So I'm going to take you on a trip back into the past. There's a saying in New Zealand. People talk about this is the drink that you have when you're not having a drink. And it usually turns out to be some kind of home brew that's about 100% proof. But I'm going to tell you about back in the 1960s, 1950s. This is the semantics that you were doing when you weren't doing semantics. And it was called, they had a name for their brand of semantics. They called it translational semantics. So translational semantics is, I'm going to just read this because I tend to digress terribly, so since time is limited, I'm just going to stay on the tracks. Translational semantics is nowadays a neglected form of semantics that predates the meteoric rise of Tarski-style truth-conditional semantics that we're also familiar with now, and which underwent that meteoric rise in the 1960s and 1970s. In translational semantics, the key semantical predicate is translates as, or some cognate term, rather than is true in, is true at, or however it's decorated. Translational semantics for both extensional and intentional languages give an account of the meaning of the sentences of the target language by means of specifying translations of these sentences into a semantically more perspicuous language, such as an enriched predicate calculus. A translational semantics may be formal, recursive, and completely rigorous. There's nothing, sort of informal or wishy-washy about translational semantics. It's the real deal. A translational semantics will typically not involve semantic assent and will not offer the modern-day semantic staples of valuations that supply formal truth conditions, satisfaction clauses, set theoretic constructs constituting the semantic values of subsentential terms of the object language, and so forth. Translational semantics offers none of that, typically. Translational semantics was supplanted by the new truth-conditional paradigm during a quite heady revolution. Some of us will have lived through it, a revolution that began in the late 60s and reached full force during the 1970s. Some of the precipitating events were the publication of Donald Davidson's paper Truth and Meaning in 1967, and Saul Kripke's succession of papers on modal semantics beginning in 1959 and continuing throughout the 1960s. And there was also the work of Montague, Hinticker, Dana Scott, and numerous others, the pioneers of the new semantical paradigm. In his now classic 1967 paper, Davidson urged that Tarski's recursive theory of truth be regarded as a theory of meaning. And he argued, quote, "A theory of meaning for a language L shows how the meanings of sentences depend on the meanings of words. And if it contains a recursive definition of truth in L," unquote. And then he added polemically, "And so far at least, we have no other idea how to turn the trick." So he's saying, well, Tarskian semantics is the only game in town if you want to give an account of how the meanings of sentences arise as a function of the meanings of their parts. But in fact, as I'll explain, translational semantics is, and was at the time Davidson was writing, perfectly capable of showing how the meanings of sentences depend on the meanings of their components. Davidson was just wrong when he said that truth-conditional semantics was the only game in town. An influential manifesto of the new paradigm in semantics, the truth-conditional paradigm, was the 1976 collection Truth and Meaning, edited by two young stormtroopers of the revolution, Gareth Evans and John McDowell. Their introduction to this volume contained a spirited attack on the older rival paradigm. They said, "We call this view," referring to the reviled translational view, "we call this view, according to which the job of a theory of meaning is to provide rules relating sentences to their semantic representations, translational semantics," unquote. And they intended to leave their readers in no doubt that translational semantics was utterly bankrupt, and they freely used words like wrong, objectionable, and utter incapacity in order to express their contempt for the outgoing paradigm. Although they were certainly rousing in those revolutionary days, I think it's true to say that their arguments have not withstood the test of time. For example, they exhorted, "What we ought to be doing is stating what sentences of the language mean, stating something such that if someone knew it, he would be able to speak and understand the language." However, that's exactly what translational semantics does do. They thought they were characterizing their own new revolutionary paradigm, but their kind of, marching songs characterized the translational paradigm just as well. Their key objection to translational semantics, which they said, quote, devastates translational semantics, is that someone could, they say, know the semantics without understanding the language of which it is a theory, unquote. That's their devastating objection. Yet exactly the same is true of truth-conditional semantics. Someone could know, for example, that, and here insert your favorite clause from truth-functional semantics, maybe V, LA, I equals T, if and only if for all J, if J is less than or equal to I, then VAJ equals T. Someone could perfectly well know that that's the right truth-conditional clause for the particle L without thereby understanding what the object language statement LA means. For a truth-conditional semantics to succeed in assigning meanings to the statements of the object language, the meta-language must not consist of mere formalism, but must be interpreted, e.g. in terms of possible worlds, accessibility, and truth at a world. And moreover, must be understood as such by the person for whom the theory is to serve as a theory of meaning for the object language. Likewise, with translational semantics, for a theory to serve as a theory of meaning, the semantically perspicuous language in which the meaning-giving translations are formulated must, of course, be understood by the person for whom the theory is to serve as a theory of meaning. And if someone does understand the semantically perspicuous language and does know the rules relating target sentences to their translations, then they will ipso facto also understand the statements of the target language. What more could you want of a theory of meaning? Because Davidsonian truth theories are extensional, extensionally equivalent expressions can be substituted into the theory without changing the truth values of the relevant T sentences. Evans and McDowell called the result of performing existentially equivalent but intentionally inequivalent substitutions a mutilated truth theory. They went on endlessly about mutilated truth theories in their lectures around this time, and they regarded mutilated truth theories as a big problem for the Davidsonian paradigm. A favourite example was a mutilated truth theory producing the true T sentence, snow is white is true if and only if grass is green. It's a T sentence and it's true, but it obviously isn't meaning-giving. Evans and McDowell were much exercised by the phenomenon of mutilated truth theories, concluding that these posed a severe challenge to Davidson's original conception of truth-theoretic semantics. And the problem, of course, is that the mutilated truth theory does not constitute a theory of meaning for the language. So the theoretical difficulty is how to exclude mutilated truth theories from the set of truth theories that are genuinely meaning-giving. And this was the answer that Evans and McDowell gave in 1976 to that question. They said, quote, "The conditions must ensure that the sentence is used on the right," so they're talking about the left and right of the T sentences or the truth clauses, "must ensure that the sentence is used on the right, translate those mentioned on the left." Really strange. They're rubbishing the translational paradigm, and yet here it comes in to the rescue. They pleaded against concluding that, quote, "we have now just come round full circle." And they were right, because they were still doing truth conditional semantics. They hadn't gone back to doing translational semantics. But, you can kind of be excused for wondering whether, despite their tendentious arguments, the truth conditional curlicues of their theory, as in, quote, "the German sentence, quote, Schnee ist weiß, unquote, is true if and only if snow is white, unquote." You might well wonder whether all those kind of curlicues and semantic assent and so on could not be dispensed with in favour of a recursive, purely translational semantics. If the translation relation, as Evans called it, is going to play such an important part in the truth conditional semantics, then do we need the truth conditional machinery? Can't we just go with the older translational form of the semantics? Another of the semantical revolutionaries was David Lewis, who coined the mantra, "Semantics with no treatment of truth conditions is not a semantics." I guess Max subscribes to that mantra as well. No truth conditions, no semantics. In two well-known paragraphs in his wonderful paper, General Semantics, Lewis attacked a then popular form of translational semantics, namely that semantic interpretation consists of the systematic translation of sentences of the target language into an artificial language that Lewis dubbed semantic marquees. And he urged that, quote, "translation into marquees is at best a substitute for real semantics." And then he mocked, "Translation into Latin might serve just as well, except insofar as the designers of marquees may choose to build into it useful features, such as freedom from ambiguity and grammar based on symbolic logic," unquote. However, those are surely crucial differences. Latin just doesn't have them. The translational semanticist certainly does not think that translation into any old language, Latin, English, Polish, is the way to do semantics. The selected language must have features that make it properly suitable for the job, and a regimented and logically transparent language based on the predicate calculus is a much more promising candidate than Latin. Mockery aside, Lewis gave two arguments against translational semantics. The first was essentially the same as the point later emphasized by Evans and McDowell, and Lewis put his version of that point this way. "But we can know the marquee's translation of an English sentence without knowing the first thing about the meaning of the English sentence, namely the conditions under which it would be true," unquote. One problem with what Lewis said is his addendum, namely the conditions under which it would be true. This addendum simply begs the question, made acute by Evans and McDowell's discussions of mutilated truth theories, of whether knowing the conditions under which a sentence is true is constitutive of knowing the meaning of the sentence. Lewis is just sort of begging the question on that point. And the second problem is that what Lewis says is simply untrue. Insofar as the assertions P and it is true that P give the same information, the speaker who knows the English sentence's translation into the semantical language and understands the semantical language does thereby know the canonical conditions under which the English sentence is true. So Lewis's criticism against translational semantics just does not cut the mustard. Lewis's second argument was that because, quote, "the marquee's method deals with nothing but symbols," this prevents marquee's semantics from dealing with the relations between symbols and the world of non-symbols, that is, with genuinely semantic relations, unquote. However, the semantical language into which the translations are carried out brings its own apparatus of real-world reference, predication, quantification, ontological commitment, and this apparatus is in gear and working when the translation sentences are spoken or written by the understanding speaker. For example, a sentence of the translationalist's semantical metalanguage of the form A bears R to B is no less about the objects A and B and the relation R than is the statement that would typically appear on the right-hand side of a truth conditional semantics, such as the ordered pair consisting of the denotation of term A followed by the denotation of term B is a member of the extension of the relation R. I mean, both those kind of sentences that are offered as the semantical interpretation of the target sentence are equally committed to reference to A, B, and R. When the understanding speaker knows that the translation of S is P, then they ipso facto have knowledge of the relationship between the string of symbols S and the world of non-symbols, and that relationship is mediated by the sentence P of the semantical metalanguage. So Lewis's second argument does not work. In his 1975 book, The Language of Truth, Jerry Fodor came roaring to the defense of translational semantics. You know, there's that phrase about Hilbert came roaring back to the defense of mathematics in the wake of Gödel's result. So I think it's, that metaphor is actually applied to Fodor as well. He came roaring back to the defense of translational semantics, which he was evidently quite fond of. So he says, quote, translational theories have recently become the object of considerable philosophical disapprobation, much of it, I think, quite undeserved, unquote. He responded to Lewis's influential critique, saying, quote, it seems pertinent to comment on a certain unfairness that attaches to Lewis's remarks, if they are taken as a general criticism of translational approaches to semantics. And then Fodor continues, it's true that we can know the Marquarese translation of an English sentence without knowing the first thing about the meaning of the English sentence, as Lewis says. But of course, this will hold for absolutely any semantic theory whatsoever, so long as it's formulated in a symbolic system. And, of course, there's no alternative to formulating one's theories, We're all in Sweeney's boat, he says. I have never been able to discover what Sweeney's boat was. If you Google Sweeney's boat, all you get are endless timetables for Sweeney's boat that goes across Loch Lomond. And whether that's what Fodor was referring to, I don't know. But the only references you get on the internet to Sweeney's boat are the boat timetables and then references to this same passage from Fodor 1975. So it's kind of a closed circle. But anyway, whatever Sweeney's boat is, we're all in it, according to Fodor. We've all got to use words when we talk, he says. I like this quote because it's sort of classic Fodor. Then he goes on, since words are not, as it were, self-illuminating like globes on a Christmas tree, there is no way in which a semantic theory can guarantee that a given individual will find its formulae intelligible. So, the sense in which we can know the Marquarese translation of an English sentence without knowing the conditions under which it could be true is pretty uninteresting. So Lewis's objection is just sort of trivial. It applies to any theory symbolically expressed. Of course, it was not only philosophical arguments that led to the demise of the translational paradigm. The sheer power and elegance of truth-conditional semantics resulted in its widespread use by logicians and mathematicians. Mathematician Frank Drake, who did work in modal logic using translational semantics before Kripke's approach to the semantics of modal logic became the default, said, I certainly regarded Kripke's later work as superseding mine, and even more so the work of Dana Scott, which I learned of in about 1965. I could remember being glad to have my PhD in my pocket when I saw Scott's work. So even amongst the translational semanticists, there was a feeling that the game was up and the truth conditional paradigm had, superseded what they were doing. Yet once translational semantics is absolved from the accusations of the revolutionaries, might there not be a role for it in modern logic? because translational semantics is leaner than its truth-theoretic brother. It carries no commitment to set theory or semantic assent. It does not assign abstract semantic values to subsentential elements of the language, nor indeed does it assign semantic values to the sentences themselves. And it approaches closer to the homophonic ideal of giving the semantics of a language without exceeding the resources of that very language. So, section 2, Prior and translational semantics. Prior was deeply into translational semantics. Arthur Prior gave translational semantics for both tensed languages and alethic modal languages. In the case of tensed languages, an early example of his translational semantics appeared in his 1954 presidential address to a conference in Wellington, New Zealand, which was later published as The Syntax of Time Distinctions. And in the case of alethic modal languages, a mature example of his translational approach appeared in his 1962 paper, Possible Worlds. Prior never believed that the semantical languages in which he couched his translations were, as he put it, metaphysically fundamental. And in the Syntax of Time Distinctions, he issued a warning against regarding his translations as a metaphysical explanation, as he put it, of the tenses. Elsewhere, Prior gave the same warning in the case of alethic modal logic, saying, "Some writers have attempted to represent modal logic as a kind of disguised quantification theory, perhaps with quantification over possible states of affairs." Then he says, "I don't myself think that this will do, though I won't develop my objections to it now." He said that in What is Logic in 1962, and it was in that very same year that he published his own translational semantics for modal logic, itself couched in terms of quantification over possible worlds. So what was Prior doing in that quote? Sort of was he, slamming into his own work and saying that it won't do? Well, no, I don't think so. I don't think he should be understood in this quotation as having some objection to possible world semantics per se. His point was, again, the metaphysical one, that the language of possible worlds, no less than a language involving quantification over times, is ultimately to be explained in terms of a language with modal operators, or in the case of time, tense operators. And that, of course, was a theme that he returned to in his final book, Worlds, Times and Selves. However, despite his metaphysical orientation regarding these matters, he considered translational semantics involving quantification over worlds and times illuminating enough to make frequent use of these semantics. Well, Prior died, of course, in 1969, never witnessing the full force of the revolution against translational semantics. So how or whether he would have contributed to the debate, we shall never know. But his 1957 review of Tarski's Logic, Semantics and Metamathematics certainly contains ammunition that might have been used against the revolutionaries. For example, Prior said, quote, "One objection which may be made against Tarski is that far too much is said in this context about sentences," unquote. So Prior disliked semantic assent, he didn't like going up into the meta language, and he was much more interested in propositions than sentences. He preferred to reformulate Tarski's famous T sentence, "The English sentence, snow is white, is true if and only if snow is white." Prior wanted to reformulate that, and his reformulation was the propositionalized, non-metalinguistic, "Whoever says that snow is white says so truly only if snow is white." No meta-language, no semantic assent, a much cleaner job altogether. In his review of Tarski, Prior also dwelt on what he called a defect in Tarski's truth theory, namely that the various different truth clauses, one for negation, one for disjunction, one for the universal quantifier, and so on, produce, quote, "a piecemeal definition of truth, and the more complex the language considered, the more pieces there will be. The result is that true has different meanings when applied to sentences of different sorts," unquote. Perhaps Prior would have wielded that same point against Davidson's conception of Tarskian semantics. The semantics requires as many different concepts of truth as there are recursive clauses in the semantics. Well, to make the notion of translational semantics concrete, I'll give some details of Prior's translational semantics for the languages of tense logic and modal logic. How am I going for time? I always completely lose track of time. What time did we start? Did anyone notice?
Between...
quarter past, I think.
Yeah, I think your talk started at between 25 minutes and 20 minutes, 2, 3.
So I should finish about, what, quarter past? Something like that?
Yeah.
All right. So Prior's tense modal and modal translational semantics is the next section. In the syntax of time distinctions, Prior explained that his new PF calculus, as he called it, is, and this is his phrase, interpretable within what he called the L calculus, where L is read is later than, and interpretable within evidently means for Prior that formulae of the PF calculus can be translated systematically into the L calculus. So Z is a variable representing the date at which the proposition under consideration is uttered, and these are the semantical clauses that Prior gives for his tense operators P and F. And G and H. G being, of course, it will always be the case that, and H, it has always been the case that. So very familiar tense logical semantical clauses, but Prior is giving them, this sort of translational spin, that the one is to be interpreted as the other or translated as the other. So clearly, Prior's translational clauses explain the meanings of FQ, PQ, GQ, and HQ to anyone who understands his augmented predicate calculus. I mean, this semantics isn't going to tell you the meanings of FQ and GQ and so on unless you know how to read the quantificational symbols, and unless you know that Z is the time of utterance and that L means later than, and that QX means that proposition Q is true at time X and so on. But as long as you understand all that, then these clauses give you the meanings of the four statement forms of the target language. Moreover, the semantics arguably shows how the meanings of the complex sentences arise from the meanings of their parts, just as Davidson required. So GPQ, to take Prior's own example, is effectively translated in two steps, the first addressing the meaning of the contained G, and the second addressing the meaning of the contained P. So translational semantics seems to meet Davidson's strictures about giving an account of how the meaning of the whole arises from the meanings of the parts. Prior's translational modal semantics is formally very similar to his tense modal semantics. The variables refer to worlds instead of times or dates, and an accessibility relation between worlds replaces the L relation. In his 1962 article, Possible Worlds, Prior wrote, "Suppose we have the usual variables P, Q, R, etc. for statements, and A, B, C, etc. for names of worlds or total states of affairs. Then let us write PA, for it is the case in world A that P. Let us interpret LPA, necessarily P in world A, as short for P is true in A and in all worlds accessible from it." So, showing no interest at all in truth conditional semantics, Prior is here providing what he referred to as an interpretation of modal statements by translating them systematically into his extended predicate calculus. This is Prior's possible world semantics, developed completely independently of Kripke. As in the tensed case, Prior's various translation clauses give meanings to the modal sentences under consideration, as long as you understand the semantical language. And again, his semantics shows how the meanings of complex sentences, such as the S4 and S5 axioms, arise from the meanings of their parts. And Pryor said that by reference to this interpretation, this translational semantics, quote, many features of the logic of necessity and possibility are readily explained. So despite his metaphysical qualms about explaining modality in terms of quantification, he nevertheless thought that you could explain a lot about modal and tense logic by doing that, even though metaphysically the true relation was the other way around. This semantics was developed in association with the Irish logician Carew Meredith, and it first appeared in Pryor's 1956 TypeScript, Interpretations of Different Modal Logics in the Property Calculus. This is the same slide that I showed in the Balliol talk. So this is a one-page document that I found in the library archives at the University of Canterbury. And Pryor circulated it in mimeograph form, and it anticipates key elements of modern possible world semantics for propositional T, S4, and S5. There's nothing about quantifiers in it. And this was years before Kripke's first very influential publications appeared. So you can see that at the top there, Pryor is giving the recursive semantical clauses for negation, which he writes N, and conditional, which of course he writes C, and then the clause for necessity, LP, and possibility, MP. And then he goes through various derivations, and as he sums up at the bottom, says, well, look, we can, by putting various postulates on the U relation, the accessibility relation, you can get either T or put some other relations on, you get S4, or you can get S5. So it all looks very familiar to the modern eye, but also it looks weirdly different as well, because there are no truth conditions, there's no meta-language, there are no set theoretic constructs offered as semantic values, none of that. It's kind of the same as we have nowadays, but also very different. The TypeScript carries the attribution CAM, August 1956, recorded and expanded ANP. It seems that what Pryor expanded was a brief note in Meredith's hand. I found this in the Bodleian, and it consists simply of 8 lines of symbols. I just came across this. I was looking for other things completely, and this piece of paper just kind of tumbled out at me. And I recognized it almost immediately, since I was already familiar with Pryor's note. And that is what was expanded. It's 8 lines of symbols, which is classic Meredith, because he loved to compress everything to the maximum possible degree. He hated using even one word too many. And in the note, Meredith set down the reflexivity and transitivity axioms for U, the clauses for negation and implication, and the definition of L. He listed KT and S4 as theses, and he marked S5 with the reversed assertion sign used by Lukasiewicz to represent rejection. So either Pryor or Pryor and Meredith together have gone on to add some S5 stuff by the time we get to this note. Well, as you can see, the calculus that's set out in this 1956 TypeScript is purely formal, and no philosophical interpretation is offered, either of the U relation or of the nature of the objects to which the various variables of the calculus refer. What are we quantifying over? On the right-hand side of the clauses for L and M, for example, for all B, or what are these B's? We just aren't told. Once the formalism has been suitably explained, suitably interpreted, the Meredith-Pryor semantics is a paradigm example of translational semantics. And Meredith was, in fact, expounding a sophisticated theory of possible worlds in 1956 and earlier. But it seems that in 1956, neither Meredith nor Pryor had any interpretation to offer of the binary relation U. And it was Peter Geach who coincidentally suggested an interpretation for U, writing a letter to Pryor in 1960 about jumping between possible worlds. Geach had this idea of a sort of science fiction dimension-jumping vehicle that could jump from one possible universe to another. And he suggested to Pry that this might have some use in modal logic. And Pry thought, oh yes, I know exactly how to use it. He seized on Geach's idea and took to describing U as a relation of accessibility between worlds. So he'd now got a complete interpretation of his and Meredith's formal translational semantics. Well, next, the Smiley barrier, very quickly. As early as 1955, Timothy Smiley at Cambridge was pursuing an approach to modal semantics that he later referred to as translational semantics. Smiley's translational semantics has some of the same flavour as Pry's. Smiley's semantical predicate, linking sentences with their translations, is written may be read as, while, as we saw earlier, Pry used is short for in his 1962 Possible Worlds article. Smiley appears to be the first person to have announced completeness proofs for modal systems T, S4 and S5 relative to a semantics, a translational semantics in this case, explicitly interpreted in terms of possible worlds. This was in 1957, well before Kripke and Hinterker and Kanger and all those other guys. The following is an extract from a 1957 lecture handout by Smiley that sets out his semantics. So I'll just let you read through this, as some of the notation is a little bit hard to pronounce. So this is a typed lecture handout that Smiley gave out in his mathematical logic lectures in Cambridge. And one of his students, David Shoesmith, squirreled this away somewhere. And when I was searching for Smiley-related documents a few years ago, David Shoesmith was able to supply me with a copy of the original lecture handout. So that's where this is from. So you can see that, although the notation's a bit weird, you can see that Smiley is giving a semantics for propositional S, or T we might call it, S4 and S5. And the 1A is like box A or LA. 1 is his necessity operator. And he says that it can be read in terms of a quantification, and then not 1 not, that's his possibility operator. That's an existential quantification. And that is necessary truths are true in all possible worlds. Proposition is possible if it's true in some possible worlds. This is the possible world semantics. Elsewhere in the lecture handout, he claims that he has completeness proofs of propositional T, S4 and S5 relative to the semantics. And then he says choice between the systems, these three systems, or others we made, blah, 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 possible worlds that are to be arranged in a hierarchy of degrees of remoteness from the actual world. So that's accessibility. So he's got it all here. So what's the Smiley barrier? Well, Smiley said to me, very regretfully, it's a pity that translational semantics turns out to be a wrong turning outside the realm of propositional logic. Translational semantics, he said, is incapable of dealing with variations in the size of the domain. So that's what I call the Smiley barrier for translational semantics. Now, obviously, I haven't got time to talk about it now, but in the published version of this paper, which I hope is going to come out in the Santhes volume that we're all contributing to, I argue that Smiley is wrong, at any rate, in the case of the Meredith Pryor possible world semantics. And it is relatively straightforward to extend their translational semantics to quantifiers, and moreover, to allow domains of various sizes. I mean, the domain of individuals doesn't have to be fixed from world to world. And in this expanded translational Meredith Pryor semantics, I use the Barkan formula as kind of the touchstone. I mean, the Barkan formula effectively says that all possible worlds have the same domain of individuals, or at the very least overlapping domains. You need one or other of those conditions to be true to get the Barkan formula coming out as valid. So I show that the Barkhan formula is invalid in my generalized version of Prior's translational semantics because essentially the domains are allowed to vary. But I show that the Barkhan formula becomes valid if you add either a postulate that all worlds have the same domain or a postulate that says that worlds have overlapping domains. So there it is. Prior can break the Smiley barrier.